Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. Just moments ago, more votes came in from Philadelphia. It's Friday morning. We're still counting votes 3 days after the election on Tuesday of this week. More votes have come in from Philadelphia, putting Joe Biden into the lead in Pennsylvania. And it now seems really beyond any doubt that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States, even as the last votes in several states are being counted to confirm that result. It's a lot closer than many of us thought, and certainly when I recorded this episode late last week with my guest, Harvard Law Professor Michael Klarman, we were anticipating a landslide. Now, Biden is probably going to end up with the exact electoral vote count that President Trump won in 2016. At that time, Trump declared he'd won in a landslide with 306 electoral votes. It's probably not a landslide. But also important is the control of the Senate now hanging in the balance, as many of the races that were thought to be contests that would flip from red to blue in the Senate ended up being very close wins for Republicans, enough so that we are really down to two runoff Senate elections in Georgia, two Senate seats that will face runoff elections in Georgia in January. And that will very likely determine control of the Senate. Now, my conversation with Professor Klarman that you're going to hear anticipated not only Biden winning the presidency, but the Democrats retaking control of the Senate. And so think about this episode as what could have been and what still could be as the stakes for those two Georgia Senate elections in January become of even greater national significance. What will happen after President Biden is inaugurated? We face a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court, thanks to Trump's last-minute, really very last-minute confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett. And we face a question of whether Democrats will have an opportunity really to pursue a legislative agenda on a range of issues, from expanding healthcare to gun control to economic reforms, infrastructure, green jobs, and addressing the threat of climate change, and on and on. Importantly, as we talk about in this conversation, Democrats have an opportunity to enact something that has become even more clearly needed in this country, which is electoral reform. The Republicans have shown that they are now the party of voter suppression, voter intimidation, of not counting the votes, of obstructing access to the vote. And Professor Klarman takes a very compelling position about the importance of opening access even more widely to the vote, and what that will do not only for the very important objective of making true on our commitment that every citizen in this country has a right to the ballot box, but what that will mean to our politics, what that will mean to the future of the Supreme Court if, as Professor Klarman argues, that Democrats should seek to expand the Supreme Court. I will admit I was a skeptic on the question of expanding the court, but after my conversation with Professor Klarman, I have to say, and I think you may also feel this way too, it seems like that is the only way that we're going to get real reforms in this country in the name of entrenching, or as Professor Klarman says, re-entrenching democracy in the United States of America. So think of this as a look at what could have been and what still might be, depending on the outcome of those two elections in Georgia, or perhaps depending on the outcome of Senate elections in 2022. Perhaps this will motivate you. Perhaps this will make you think hard and differently. It certainly has done that for me. I know you will enjoy this very stimulating, thought-provoking, and ever more crucial conversation on the future of the Supreme Court and on the future of democracy in the United States today. Stay tuned. We're talking today about the newest member of the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett, and what the impact of her joining the court will be in the short term as we come out of the election that will have just occurred as we air this episode, and over the longer term as the Supreme Court has been reshaped. My guest today is Michael Klarman, a professor of constitutional law and constitutional history from Harvard Law School. Michael, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law today.
Sure, thanks for having me.
This is something I know you have been talking about. Just a little background on you, Michael. You have a stellar resume, a BA and master's from Penn, law degree from Stanford, and a doctor of philosophy from Oxford. You're the author of 3 books, one on the Brown versus Board of Education landmark desegregation decision, a book called Unfinished Business, Racial Equality in American History, and a book on the struggle for same-sex marriage called From the Closet to the Altar. And perhaps, I don't want to say most relevantly, but certainly relevant to our conversation today, you had the privilege of clerking for Ruth Bader Ginsburg when she was on the Court of Appeals in Washington before she was elevated to the Supreme Court. So maybe that's just the raw bio statistics type stuff. Well, maybe let me hone in on your clerkship for then Judge, future Justice Ginsburg, as somebody who had that background, as well as your other the other parts of your background. What did you think when you saw the news that Amy Coney Barrett was going to be nominated? Of course, now she's been confirmed, but even when she was nominated to take Justice Ginsburg's seat on the Supreme Court?
I don't think that any president is bound to replace somebody who's died or departed with a similar ideology. I don't even think President Trump is bound to care about Justice Ginsburg's last words, that she'd prefer that the next president, the president elected on November 3rd, be the one to replace her. The Republican hypocrisy from what they said in 2016 is jaw-dropping. It's probably the most hypocritical thing I can remember in my 45, 50 years of following American politics. We saw this demonstrated in lots of video segments where Republicans like Lindsey Graham or Mitch McConnell or Joni Ernst said quite literally 4 years ago in February of 2016 that the president shouldn't be replacing anyone in the last year of the president's term. And now we find the president replacing someone in the last couple of weeks before an election. Again, the hypocrisy is stunning. It demonstrates that we're in a situation where all that matters is power and the will to use it, and any professed principles that are driving decision-making are just for show. Amy Barrett is, I think, I know her just a little bit. I think we've debated originalism once or twice. She's a very nice person, and it's hard not to admire her adopting young Black kids from Haiti, or raising a child with pretty severe disabilities. I don't think she's any different than anyone else that President Trump would put on the Supreme Court, or indeed any Republican president would put on the Supreme Court. I don't think a President Romney or a President McCain would be nominating somebody very different. So my concerns are not specifically about her, but the fact that the court now has a 6-3 extremely conservative majority, a majority more conservative probably than any time in the last 100 years, in a country that's pretty clearly moving to the left. Democrats are likely to win the popular vote for the 7th time in 8 elections. Democratic Senate candidates win literally tens of millions more votes than Republican Senate candidates, even when they don't win a majority control of the Senate. It's very troubling, and I think potentially pretty problematic to have such a conservative court at a time that the country is probably moving pretty significantly to the left. So that's what I think.
Let me push back on that a little bit. The point about would a nominee from a President Romney or McCain have really been all that different? Maybe not, but I've been covering Supreme Court confirmation battles, or thinking about them, since I was covering those battles as a reporter in Washington in the 80s. And I mean, I wrote extensively covering the confirmation battle over Judge Bork, and the confirmation struggles that followed after that, Clarence Thomas and some ill-fated nominees as well along the way. But there was a time, it does seem, there was a time before, let's say the 1980s, before the Reagan years, when there was it seems, a real focus on achieving a new conservative or a new kind of conservative dominance on the Supreme Court that culminates now with the confirmation of Justice Barrett. There was a time when nominees from both parties seemed much, much less ideological, so much less obviously political choices, and more about, let me find somebody supremely qualified to sit on the Supreme Court. I mean, I wonder if somebody like McCain or Romney, being more moderate Republicans, being less obviously ideological in their political focus, might have been chosen somebody more like the way nominees were chosen, what now seems like way back when.
I think not, and I'll explain why I think that. George W. Bush, of course, nominated Chief Justice Roberts and Samuel Alito. I don't see them being ideologically any different from Amy Barrett. It's true that Chief Justice, I think for strategic reasons, has voted to join the liberals in a few landmark cases in the last 10 years, most notably the Affordable Care Act case, the census question case, and a couple cases last term, including the DACA case and the Louisiana abortion case. What you describe is absolutely true, but it's a function of us living in a different political universe than the United States occupied in the 1960s, 1970s, and that we were transitioning from in the 1980s and 1990s. So it's important for people to realize, and I think young people may not even appreciate, that the parties didn't used to be ideologically polarized hardly at all. People forget that Republicans in Congress were actually slightly more likely to vote for the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act than Democrats. Yeah. And in terms of ideological commitment, the Republican Party was probably not right of center of the Democratic Party in the 1960s, and in the 1970s, barely so. It was beginning to move in that direction. Ronald Reagan's presidency was the beginning of a significant departure, but the parties were still overlapping, and there were lots of people splitting their ballots. There were tons of people who voted for a Republican president, but a Democratic congressman, Democratic senators in the 1970s. That almost never happens anymore today. There were lots of conservatives in the Democratic Party and plenty of liberals in the Republican Party. Nelson Rockefeller was the most pro-abortion governor, maybe the most pro-abortion Republican politician in the country in the 1960s and early 1970s. So there's been just a fundamental shift in the nature of politics and polarization. So the parties are now ideologically pure, meaning that the most liberal Republican in Congress is more conservative than the most conservative Democrat. And both parties have moved away from the center, although political scientists have shown the Republican Party has moved about twice as far to the right as the Democratic Party has to the left. And when you add in things like primaries, which now are really only elections that matter, you've got an even more conservative electorate. The Federalist Society in the last 40 years has provided kind of a right-wing intellectual bubble through which these people are groomed. So you're not going to get, Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren, Eisenhower appointed William Brennan, President Nixon appointed Harry Blackmun, President Ford appointed John Paul Stevens. even George H.W. Bush appointed David Souter. Those, from the perspective of today's conservatives, were mistakes, and the Federalist Society makes sure you're not going to have any more mistakes. The right wing's mobilization against Harriet Miers, which most people today don't even know about, but I'm sure you remember, in 2006, 2005, was a way to ensure that only a Federalist Society vetted conservative could get on the court. So, of course, you're not going to have unanimous confirmations like Nino Scalia in 1986, or Justice Ginsburg, I think, had 3 votes against her in 1993. There just is no political ideological overlap, and politics is now broken, and the Republican Party, through the guise of Mitch McConnell, decided to break kind of the last norm, which is if a president dies and a Democratic president's in office, you maybe can exert some pressure to nominate someone extremely moderate like Merrick Garland, but you don't just get to block them. That's literally never been done in American history. So the norms of the institution are completely broken, and that's a huge problem, because democracy ultimately depends not just on rules, but also on norms and institutions. And we're in a very, very dangerous place right now.
Well, and I want to get into some of the specific subjects that the Supreme Court we know is going to be taking on, and what impact do you think essentially a 6-3 conservative majority on the court will have on those issues. But on the issue of the institutional integrity of the court, I mean, many have observed that one of the many terrible things that has defined the Trump presidency is the overt efforts to undermine confidence and the integrity of all institutions that make up the pillars of our democracy, from the media to Congress to the court, from trial court judges all the way up to the Supreme Court. I wonder, clearly, as the political parties have become more ideological pure, as you've explained it, their nominees are going to necessarily also become more extreme. You're not going to have a center on the court. You're just going to have liberals and conservatives now. I read, I think it was an interview you gave, that Justice Kavanaugh may be seen now as the swing vote on the court, which I find absolutely staggering to consider. But how big an impact do you think there is in the public's cynicism and lack of confidence in the integrity of an institution like the Supreme Court? I'm thinking, for example, of something I was talking to my daughter about at lunch today, which is that both Kavanaugh and Barrett have, as part of their resume of experience, the fact that they worked for President Bush on the Bush v. Gore battle. And, you know, it's kind of hard not to imagine that as we approach another election where we're openly talking about, will the Supreme Court step in? And in fact, the Supreme Court already has stepped in on some state issues that affect how ballots will be counted. Will the Supreme Court be doing that again? Perhaps even this very week as this episode airs. It's hard to get that out of your mind, that both Kavanaugh and Barrett have that as part of their resume of experience. And do you see those kinds of concerns eroding public confidence in the court, and what impact do you think that has long term?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm not sure that public confidence in the Supreme Court shouldn't be eroded. I'm not invested in the conventional lawyerly myth that Supreme Court justices are somehow able to abstract from politics and be neutral umpires, as Chief Justice Roberts would have it, calling balls and strikes. I think the Supreme Court's always been political, and I think it's almost inevitable that justices will bring to their work their own background experience, their personal values, their perceptions of what politics allows you to get away with, and they are a reflection of the historical moment and culture in which they live. I'm not particularly opposed to that, but the myth that somehow you can divest yourself of all that when you don the black robes I think is not a particularly appealing myth. And given what the Supreme Court has done in terms of undermining democracy in the last couple of decades, I actually might think it be kind of healthy for the American public to lose confidence in that myth. So we have a Supreme Court. I'll come back to what you mentioned about how the court's already been intervening in this election in regard to all this litigation across the country. This is a Supreme Court that struck down the preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act, which unleashed southern states to try to interfere with the right to vote in a multitude of ways. This is a Supreme Court that upheld voter ID laws and voter purges on the basis of a supposed state interest in reducing voter fraud, even though we know from many academic studies that voter impersonation fraud is essentially a non-existent problem. This is a court that refused to do anything about political gerrymandering, which is an enormous problem in American politics. This is a Supreme Court that almost single-handedly has virtually ruined our political system by unleashing unrestricted money in politics on the basis of the thinnest of constitutional rationales. And as you just noted, when this is just extraordinary to think about it. Basically, it would not be an overstatement to say in the last 2 months, the Republican legislatures in the states and the governors are essentially making it harder to vote in every way they can think of, whether it's refusing to extend the period in which absentee ballots are received and counted, whether it's limiting the number of drop boxes to drop off absentee ballots, whether it's waiving witness signature requirements in the midst of the worst public health crisis in the last 100 years. It shows great creativity on their part, but also a kind of moral reprehensibleness that their view is we want to restrict voting in every way we possibly can. And the Republican justices have essentially gone along with that on the basis of this so-called Purcell principle, which was not really a principle, but was a kind of mild presumption that you shouldn't be changing election rules soon before the election. Now, there are two problems with deferring to that principle, even though it wasn't a principle, it was a couple sentences in a summary opinion. It does make a certain amount of sense that you shouldn't be radically overhauling election rules right before an election. But notice two things. Any rule was created to be broken under extraordinary circumstances. And as I said, this is a pandemic that is literally a once in a century health crisis. And if you're not going to change the rules, for example, to ensure that voters who are voting absentee can have their ballots counted, we're not even talking about extending the date by which they vote, just the date by which it's counted. It's really hard to understand how it adds any voter confusion to say if you get your absentee ballot in and get it postmarked on time, that we're going to keep counting if it shows up a couple days late. Instead, they are literally guaranteeing that thousands of voters will be disfranchised. So the first problem is any rule has exceptions, and this was not supposed to be a conclusive presumption anyhow, just a kind of mild presumption. The other problem, which is even more enormous, is that if you read the opinion that came down from the court in the Wisconsin case, there is literally not a word in there noting politically what's going on here. Republican legislatures and Republican governors are being deferred to on this general theory that legislatures are better at weighing things like the costs and benefits of a particular electoral rule. But there is absolutely no indication that they've gone beyond the naive assumption that these are good faith decisions rather than Republican efforts to suppress Democratic votes. The Supreme Court's not required to be that naive. Chief Justice Roberts in the census case says judges do not somehow sign up to give up their insight and pretend that they don't see what's going on in the world. So an opinion that acts like the governor of Texas has neutrally weighed the advantages and disadvantages of having one drop box per county rather than just trying to suppress as many Democratic absentee votes as possible is really quite extraordinary. And I'd actually be pretty happy for the country to understand that and not forget that. And if that means they're not going to defer to a Supreme Court that decides to strike down a Democratic bill trying to entrench democracy by expanding the right to vote, I'm actually all in favor of that. So yes, of course the Supreme Court is going to sacrifice its legitimacy if they come down on the side of Republican vote suppression. I'm a little more optimistic than what you suggested in terms of this election coming down to the Supreme Court, because I think it's more likely than not Joe Biden is going to win by a large enough margin that we're not going to end up having lots of litigation over a few thousand votes here and there. But I could be wrong. There is still a scenario where Biden very narrowly loses Pennsylvania. And even though he wins in the country by 5 or 6 percentage points, he loses Pennsylvania by a couple thousand votes. And then everything's going to come down to litigation. And if there's litigation and it gets up to the Supreme Court, I think we've already seen that movie. We know how that comes out. And should that be regarded as a legitimate decision? Of course not. There'll be people in the streets protesting, and there should be.
Well, and maybe worse than that. And yeah, I didn't mean to suggest I think that's what's going to happen either. I mean, I'm very hopeful that even though it seems ridiculous to say that a candidate has to win by a landslide in order to avoid the election ending up in the Supreme Court, that idea in itself just seems so absurd. But I think I do think that could very well be what will have happened here. But
I agree with that. And the Electoral College has no justification. It should be eliminated, but it requires a constitutional amendment. And in a world where one of the dominant political parties benefits from the status quo, it is almost literally impossible to get a constitutional amendment. So Democrats are kind of stuck with that. One mild amelioration of the problem is to admit additional states, which would also solve some of the problem of the vast malapportionment of the Senate. And that should be one of the #1 items for Democrats. Is there are only 2 reasons why Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico are not states. One of them is partisanship and one of them is racism, and neither of those are good reasons. So Democrats surely ought to do the right thing and make those states, and that will ameliorate the problem that Donald Trump could easily be president, losing by more than the 3 million votes he lost. He could lose by 6 million votes and still have a chance of winning the Electoral College. And that's just absurd. There is no good justification for that, even though conservatives will sometimes try to come up with one, but they're not persuasive. If we were designing the system from scratch, nobody would say this is a sensible way to select the president. Even the framers didn't think it was sensible, but they were desperate because they couldn't come up with a good way of selecting the president, and this was a way of satisfying various constituencies.
Right. It's the other ill-fated bargain that was made at the founding. For sure, we're living with it today. But I hadn't really thought I was going to get into the issue of expanding the court this early in our conversation. But actually, because I was going to talk about some of the issues, but I think it actually frames a conversation on the issues because again. And I think people are too perhaps cautious or shy or timid. We don't want to get into the issue. The other side will frame it as packing the court, which has a negative connotation as compared to the concept of expanding the court. But I've read an interview with you in the Harvard Gazette where you talk about this, and it's actually, it's much bigger the way you lay it out than just the idea of adding justices to the court, in the same way that I think you would probably spin out the argument for adding Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, which would add 4 senators. Of course, Democrats have to take back the Senate in order for this to happen, not just take the White House, obviously. But to not only assure a different balance of power, certainly than we've seen for too many years. I mean, Barack Obama had 2 years of a cooperative Congress and then had 6 years of McConnell blocking everything he tried to do. So we really have had for the last decade, in effect, the most powerful body in the country being the Republican-controlled Senate. In terms of blocking anything from getting done and giving us three conservative justices to the Supreme Court. But your way of thinking about the idea of expanding the court is that not only and I'll have you walk us through it too, because there is some detailed understanding this, but it's not only about expanding the court, it actually will have a number of downstream consequences in our politics, perhaps even to restoring some cooperativeness among the Democrat and Republican parties, perhaps depolarizing or unpolarizing the political parties in this country when you really play it out a few steps. So I think you know what I mean. And I think it's really worth thinking about, because it will take people of this country to make that happen. It will take people getting pissed off enough
Yeah.
at what's going to happen in order for these things to take place.
So let me spin out the argument, which takes a few minutes. I think democracy in the United States is very much at risk, and some of that is President Trump's openly authoritarian bent, including attacking independent judges. But a lot of it is the Republican Party's assault on democracy in the states in the form of voter suppression, voter purges, egregious forms of gerrymandering, trying to undermine the power of governorships when they've lost the governorship to a Democrat, ignoring the results of referenda that they don't like, making it harder to get initiatives on the ballot because they basically don't want to hear from majorities of the people if they disagree with Republican policies. So what Democrats need to do, this is the critical thing that needs to happen, and I think this needs to happen if you're going to get climate change legislation, if you're going to get gun control legislation, if you're going to get reasonable immigration reform legislation, Democrats need to take power at the national level and entrench democracy. As you said, this is all just a theoretical moot question if Democrats don't win the Senate and the presidency and the House, but that is actually 75 to 80% likely to happen. Democrats have about a 75% chance to win the Senate. They have about an 89% chance to win the presidency and about a 98% chance to hold on to the House. So Democrats may very well control the national government. And it's worth pointing out that is overcoming various structural obstacles that actually make it almost impossible for Democrats to exercise unified power at the national level without winning a landslide. The combination of partisan gerrymandering and what we call geographic clustering, simply Democrats living in large cities like Philadelphia and thus being disadvantaged in congressional districts and in state legislative seats in Pennsylvania, Democrats are vastly disadvantaged both in state legislatures and in the House. And I'll just give Pennsylvania as an example. Democrats have not controlled the state Senate in Pennsylvania for the last 4 decades, even though Democrats regularly win a majority of the vote in state legislative elections, control the governorship, control one or both of the Senate seats very often. That's partly gerrymandering, but it's even more this phenomenon of geographic sorting, which means most of the Democrats are packed into Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, whereas across the rest of the state, Republicans are much more evenly distributed. So you get all these congressional districts or state legislative districts that are 80-20 Democratic and all these Republican districts that are 60-40 Republican, and it ends up making the Democratic vote largely wasted. So even if Democrats win 55% of the state legislative vote in Pennsylvania, there's a very high probability that Republicans control the state legislature. The Senate is massively malapportioned to the disadvantage of Democrats, by which I mean simply Wyoming has 600,000 people and gets the same 2 senators as California with 40 million people. And given a very strong correlation today between political geography and partisanship, the small, sparsely populated states are overwhelmingly Republican leaning. And then you get the Electoral College, which right now in the current moment is very disadvantageous to Democrats. Trump has a 10% chance of being reelected while losing the popular vote. So notwithstanding all that, Democrats nonetheless have almost a 3/4 opportunity, 3/4 chance to control the national government, and they need to take advantage of that to try to entrench democracy. And the main features of that would be things like automatic voter registration, same-day registration, ending felon disfranchisement, making Election Day a national holiday, expanding the number of early voting days, polling places, absentee balloting should be universal without excuse, do away with onerous identification requirements that disadvantage Democratic constituencies disproportionately, and political gerrymandering. The problem is, even though that law will be one of the first things Democrats want to pass, there's a plausible, if not probable, chance that the Supreme Court would strike it down, at least insofar as you're regulating the state conduct of state elections. So I think it becomes unavoidable, if you want to protect democracy, that you're going to need to do something about the Supreme Court. Now, this is a radical reform measure, which I wouldn't have dreamed of talking about 5 years ago, and nobody I know was talking about 5 years ago, but Mitch McConnell literally stole the Democrats' chance to control the court. So there are a couple different cases to make. One is responding to the main argument against. So the main argument against doing this is obviously the argument that Republicans will retaliate when they have a chance. But that's not a good argument, partly because Republicans are the ones who packed the court in 2016 by essentially limiting the court size to 8 and then expanding it again to 9 when Trump won the presidency. But even more so, you have to understand that Republicans will simply enlarge the court the first time they have the opportunity and the perceived need to do so, whether Democrats do it or not. And this is a point about Mitch McConnell and hardball. Mitch McConnell has been willing to do anything that are within the formal limits of the Constitution to advantage the Republican Party, even though it means breaking the norms and institutions, institutional traditions that are essential to protecting democracy. So what he did.
That's Trump's line.
What's that?
Elections have consequences. That's Trump's line. You can throw it back.
So elections do have consequences. And McConnell said this week, and it's absolutely true, that what he did in 2016, even though it broke every norm and historical tradition, was not unconstitutional. And what they did in 2020, even though it was flagrantly hypocritical and defied what they said in 2016, is within the bounds of the Constitution. So is expanding the size of the court. Now, just consider this hypothetical. So suppose this is not hypothetical. Republicans now have a 6-3 majority. Suppose Biden wins the election next week. Suppose Democrats win the Senate. Suppose that there's a tragic automobile accident when Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas go off to a Nationals game in the spring of 2021. Joe Biden replaces them with 2 Democratic Court of Appeals judges. Democrats now have a 5-4 majority. But suppose Joe Biden loses the presidency in 2024 and Democrats lose the Senate. Do you not think for a second that Mitch McConnell will say, okay, it's time to expand the court. We're not violating the Constitution. Democrats talked about doing this in 2020, so we might as well do it since they talked about it. That would be simply in line with everything else he's done in the last 15 years, blocking all of Obama's Court of Appeals nominees in his last 2 years in the presidency, abusing the filibuster in a way it's never been abused in American history, blocking Obama appointments to executive agencies so that the agencies literally could not function because they did not have a quorum, engineering it so essentially no Republicans supported the Obama stimulus bill, even though it was the worst economic depression since the Great Depression. It would be the analogy of Democrats saying in April or March of this year, we're not going to support a pandemic relief bill because it might help President Trump win re-election, which literally not a single Democrat said, but essentially every Republican said in 2009. That's the situation that we're dealing with right now. So Democrats need to just face the fact that if they don't do this, Republicans will do it anyhow the first time they see the need to do it. Now, you alluded to this other point, which is another response to the argument if Democrats do it, Republicans do it, which is just this idea that maybe you could create a new political epoch where the Republican Party, because they're so systematically opposed to majority rule and they suppress the vote and their policies are not very popular, they might actually start to lose elections if Democrats entrench democracy. If you did away with the voter suppression, if you created a few more Democratic senators, the Republicans might lose enough elections that they realize they have to broaden their appeal. They have to drop the racism, the misogyny, the homophobia, and they also might need to support some economic equality measures that are broadly popular, raising minimum wage, taxing the wealthy a little bit more, providing free college to people who don't make more than $100,000 a year. Those policies are very popular, as is immigration reform, climate change legislation. The reason why those don't get enacted is because the Republican Party opposes them and don't pay an electoral price because of the voter suppression and the systematic structural advantages they have in the system. So the independent case for court expansion, so far I just responded to the argument against, the independent case is we now have a center-left country and an extremely conservative court. Now, you can't do that much about the political structures at the national level. You can't change the Electoral College. You can't reapportion the Senate. Those require constitutional amendments, and a constitutional amendment is almost literally impossible if one of the political parties benefits from the status quo. After November 3rd, Democrats will almost certainly have won the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections. Democratic Senate candidates won 18 million more votes in 2018 than Republican Senate candidates, but Republicans control the Senate 53-47. The affirmative case for controlling the court is you can't do away with those structural disadvantages, but you can do away with the advantage in the Supreme Court because you can change the Supreme Court by statute. It's been done before. Now, the argument that Democrats are entitled to control, 5 of the 6 Republican justices were appointed by a president who did not enter the White House with even a plurality of the popular vote, and 4 of the 6 Republican justices were confirmed by slender Republican majorities where the Republican senators who voted for their confirmation were not supported by a majority of American voters. So, try to fix the Senate by making a couple states out of DC and Puerto Rico, but fix the Supreme Court while you have the chance to do so. And the last part of the argument is Democrats may not have this opportunity again because it is certainly plausible they will lose the House or the Senate in 2 years, just as happened after the 2008 landslide. They lost the House 2 years later. And more importantly, demographic changes will doom Democrats never to control the Senate within the next 10 or 15 years. This is basically the story of people moving to cities. In 20 years, demographers estimate 15 states will hold 70% of the population. Those 15 states will elect 30 senators. The other 70% of the population, the other 30% of the population will control, 30% of the population will control the other 35 states that elect 70 senators. And if the partisan geography holds, meaning rural voters vote disproportionately Republican, Democrats may never control the Senate again. So you actually need to do this right away. You can't wait and see what the Supreme Court does. And this Supreme Court could strike down climate change legislation. They will strike down gun control legislation. They'd strike down a wealth tax. You can't wait and see, because what they'll do is they'll just wait till Democrats no longer control the national government, and then they'll pursue their ideological preferences. I know that probably sounds radical to some people, especially lawyers who are used to the idea that we don't expand the court. But if you understand how dire the threat to democracy is, how desperate the Republican Party has become to hold power, and how they've gerrymandered the system in their direction, something needs to be done. And I think it actually has to start with Democrats doing something about the Supreme Court once they have the power to do so.
Well, I think, one of the other points you've made about this is, and you gave us a list of things to legislators, part of an initial legislative package. It is incredible to think how much we celebrate the right to vote, the core of our civic duty, and the efforts by one party to restrict the right to access to the vote. And people don't seem bothered by that. I mean, people are bothered by it. I guess people who are Republicans don't seem bothered that their party stands for that at its core. And that if there's any chance for Trump to win, for those who are still, campaigning, this week we're still campaigning in the final days of the election, you have to know that the only way he can win is because of those measures. And that has to be part of the effort, as you say, to make people understand that there are other changes too. I mean, Texas could go blue this election. If not this time, it's certainly moving in that direction. And with their electoral votes, it could be an awfully long time before we ever see a Republican president again.
Totally agreed. And let me respond to that. So if it weren't for the voter suppression, I think Democrats would be more likely than not to win Texas, even with the voter suppression. And Georgia's governor, Brian Kemp, when he was Secretary of State, was the maestro of voter suppression. And I think they almost certainly stole the election from Stacey Abrams in 2018. I think Democrats are going to win in Georgia. And I think part of the reason is because they've gone so far in this direction that there's a backlash. And that's why African Americans are waiting in line 10 hours in the city of Atlanta, which just is an utter moral outrage, because they're going to say, look, we're not going to let you take away our right to vote. John Lewis got his head busted on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and we're going to honor his legacy. Now, I want to say something about how why the Republican Party is doing this, and why it's not seen as obviously morally reprehensible. I don't think most people who vote Republican actually are aware of most of what's going on. I think all elected Republican politicians know what's going on. But remember, in Florida, in the referendum to restore the right to vote to former felons, people who are disfranchised because they were felons, 64% of Floridians voted to restore the right to vote after you served your prison sentence. And the Republicans in the state legislature said, oh my God, this is 1.4 million people who are disproportionately persons of color who hate our party for pretty good reasons, and we can't allow them to be re-enfranchised. So now we're adopting a modern poll tax, and we're going to say, well, we're not going to re-enfranchise them until they pay their court fees and costs and restitution, even though it's Kafkaesque. They can't even find out how much they owe. So how can a Republican legislature do that after 64% of voters said, no, we want these people to vote? The answer is lots of voters are not aware and probably don't support what the Republican legislature do. Why is this happening now? Republicans didn't do this 25 years ago. Why are they doing it now? It's a combination of elections are closer at the national level between the two parties than they were for most of American history. We learned that dramatically with the 537 votes in Florida that determined the outcome of the presidential election in 2000. But for large chunks of American history, one of the parties was presumptively dominant. It was the Republican Party from 1896 to 1932, the Democratic Party from 1932 to 1968. Most of the presidential elections for the 20 years after that were landslide victories for Republicans, while Democrats controlled the House and the Senate almost for the entirety of the next 20 years. And in the last 25 years, we've had really close elections and changing control of both houses. So that's one factor. The other factor is the more important one, which is changing demographics, growing secularization of the country, and growing social liberalization, especially on issues of gender equality and equality for gays and lesbians. Those have created a situation where the Republican Party is starting to lose the support of a majority of the country. And it's not surprising when you see yourself not just losing an occasional election, but probably going to lose forever into the future, that you start to sour on democracy. So that's white Southerners deciding to secede in 1860 for the first time when a Republican president gains control of the presidency. They see the handwriting on the wall, the nation's going to turn against slavery in the long term, so they decide we're going to take our marbles and go home. That's what the Republican Party is doing, and it's changes with regard to race. The country's gradually losing its white majority. The country has already ceased to be, in an informal sense, a Christian nation. The younger generation is much more secular. Even among white Christian evangelicals, who are the base of the Republican Party, their numbers have declined by about 50% in the last 12 or 15 years. And then the radical libertarians, who don't really believe in democracy to begin with, only believe in property rights and protecting against redistribution, they certainly see the future as very threatening, because the extreme economic inequality that has manifested itself for the last 40 years, Americans are waking up to this. Both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders ran on this in 2016. The difference is Trump lied about what he would do about it. He ran as a populist, governed as a plutocrat, but the Democratic Party has moved to the left, and large majorities of Americans support wealth taxes, support a higher minimum wage, support free college for people who don't make $100,000 a year, support expanded health care, affordable to everybody. That's going to happen, and once it happens, it's going to be popular, and the extreme libertarians are never going to win again if you entrench democracy. That's why it's happening right now. I think it's almost predictable when you see a group of people who are desperate because the future holds so little promise for them. They're trying to hang on to the past.
Well, it's, whether you focus on the issues that you're concerned about, and we did start talking about Amy Coney Barrett, whether you worry about the rights that she could undo, whether it's Roe versus Wade, whether it's the Obergefell same-sex marriage decision, further erosion of voting rights that the Supreme Court could engage in, or worry about passing all kinds of great legislation in a new Biden administration through a Democratic Congress, undone by the time it gets up to the Supreme Court. It seems like either way you look at the future, let's say of the next 4 years and beyond, it sounds like you're saying you have to expand the court. I mean, we almost have no choice. If you miss the moment,
you may never have another chance.
You may never have another chance, and you may never actually be able to accomplish anything, even with full control of the federal government.
So my colleague, Charles Freed, who was the Solicitor General in the Reagan administration, but has moved significantly to the left and is appalled by what the Republican Party has become, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, I think it was this past Monday, if not, it was the Monday before, and he said, well, Republicans deserve to have the court enlarged, but it's a radical step. Let's just sort of threaten them, hold it as a sort of Damocles, but wait to see what the Supreme Court does first. There are two problems with that, as I said to Charles in an email, and I think he actually may have been at least partially persuaded by my response. One is the Supreme Court will behave strategically. Justices have done that historically. Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Kavanaugh are extremely bright men, but also very savvy about their politics. They've performed in political, Roberts was in the Reagan administration, Kavanaugh was George W. Bush's private secretary. I mean, they are politically savvy, and they understand they're not going to provoke Democrats while they control the national government. So they're not going to strike down Obamacare. They're not going to do that in the case that's going to be argued. I don't think they're even interested in striking down overturning Obergefell. I think they understand that there's too much water under the bridge. The country has already moved on gay marriage. But what they'll refrain from doing in the next 2 years is striking down a big democracy entrenching law, striking down, obviously they're not going to strike down COVID relief or even healthcare expansion. But Democrats may very well lose control of the House in 2022, just like they lost it in 2010. McConnell is already setting things up so that Biden is going to face an economy that is even more in dire straits than it needs to be. That's why he's refusing to support another COVID relief bill, because he wants to set it up so that Biden has to deal with a deformed economy rather than help the economy. He's decided, McConnell's decided Trump's going to lose, and so he wants to make sure that Biden administration's a failure, just like he said explicitly that the one thing he wants to make sure about Barack Obama is that he's a one-term president. So here are the two reasons you can't wait. One, the Supreme Court will outwait you, and second, you may have 2 years to do this and never have another opportunity to do it. I'd actually be happy to contemplate some sort of deal where you could sort of say to the Supreme Court, but it's not easy to make deals because the Supreme Court's not allowed to do this. It would have to be an implicit deal, which might not be worth very much. I would essentially say, look, if we can guarantee that 4 or 5 major pieces of legislation, including democracy entrenchment, will not be struck down, we're willing to make a deal where you don't even have to give us majority control, but rather what we're going to do is fix a broken system where the Supreme Court justices are appointed by presidents, and justices time their retirements to control who replaces them, and they can serve for 30 or 40 years, and it's entirely random when they leave. There is a very sensible solution being proposed of 18-year staggered terms, which would solve a lot of problems, but it requires almost certainly a constitutional amendment. And, if you could transition to that by saying the Supreme Court is not going to strike down everything that Democrats do, I'd actually be willing to consider that, even though I think Democrats are entitled to control the court. But it's really hard to think how you get from this point to that point, because you can't make formal deals with the Supreme Court. And frankly, I don't believe anything Mitch McConnell says, so I'm not even willing to make a deal with him because I think he'd breach the deal in a second. And Donald Trump obviously is a pathological liar. You can't. So if you can't believe that your trading partner, negotiating partner operates in good faith, it's hard to make deals.
That was the thought that I had. Nobody's word is good anymore. I mean, Lindsey Graham is on record, not just in writing, but on video saying,
hold it against me. Remember I said this.
So just be careful how you phrase that. Nobody's view on the political right seems to be worth anything. It's not like people on the left have systematically lied in the same sort of way. I know that a lot of people will say all politicians are the same, but that's actually a large part of the problem for where we are now, is this false equivalency. These two political scientists, very important figures, Norman Ornstein and Thomas Mann, wrote a book 8 years ago. Now, they are very much in the middle. One of them works in a liberal think tank, one works in a conservative think tank. They wrote a book 8 years ago called It's Even Worse Than It Seems. And the argument was the Republican Party has become an extreme outlier, radical outlier that does things like threatening default on the national debt when they don't get their way in negotiations. That's not the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party doesn't do that. And they were exactly right about that, but they immediately lost all their invitations to appear on Sunday talk shows because, of course, all politicians are alike, and the fact that you're only criticizing one side means that you're partisan. But it's not partisan to criticize one side that lies and is an extreme outlier, and not to criticize the other side, which in fact is not the same thing. So I know you didn't mean that, but when you said, you can't trust anyone, I don't think we have any proof that you can't trust Barack Obama or that you can't trust Nancy Pelosi. I don't know that they've lied. I haven't seen any of them. Whereas Lindsey Graham is on tape saying, use my words against me.
Right, that's absolutely true. No, I think you're right. And it's easy to fall into these comfortable but false equivalencies. You're right, and just like it's true that there aren't necessarily two sides to every issue.
Exactly, and it used to be true, right? That's why we fall into it, because the Republican Party and the Democratic Party weren't that different. There were, liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. There was no, this is fascinating. I just learned this while I was working on the Harvard Law report I was writing. There was no God gap between the country in the 1960s. Democrats and Republicans were just as likely to go to church once a week. Their views on abortion didn't line up along party lines. The most pro-abortion rights politician in the country was Republican Governor Nelson Rockefeller. Democratic Catholic politicians like Ted Kennedy, Edmund Muskie were very measured in their views on abortion. That changed over the course of the 1970s, and it was only in 1980 that you had a Republican Party that was lined up, platform committed to only appoint anti-abortion judges. That's when the God gap developed. On race, I think I might have already mentioned, in 1964, more Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act than Democrats. Right? The two parties were ideologically fungible on racial issues. There was no clear division on religious issues. There was no clear division. That was kind of an oddity, right? I mean, to have political parties that are not ideologically divided is not the normal state of affairs, but it was the American state of affairs because of the historical accident that white Southerners voted Democratic because they blamed Republicans for the end of slavery and Reconstruction.
Well, there were real ideological differences, and what's I think what explains so many Republicans, so many former conservative writers, thinkers, and politicians who have left Trump, is that the things that were the ideological differences that led to real debates on things like trade and taxes and government spending and fiscal response. I mean, those things there were ideological differences of what's the role of government, but it's become about religion and race, and immigration is also about race, and those things are the defining polarizing issues now.
Right.
But we went a long way from, it's interesting sometimes, just I guess as a final thought on this, that this is true of life. Sometimes when you think things are the darkest, when you think that it can't get worse, maybe that actually isn't a moment of opportunity. And I actually heard Biden interviewed the other day on this. He was talking about climate change. When you think about the enormity, we now call it the existential threat that is climate change. it would be easy to feel like you just want to crawl into your bed and hide from this. It's so dire. I mean, the world is going to burn up to death or drown in storms or whatever. But his point, which I thought really was so well said and so right on the point, it's an opportunity. It isn't just an overwhelmingly dark, cloud that has descended on the planet. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to think about, how we're going to think about job creation in the future and all kinds of things. Similarly, you could say, and many people who, didn't even have a chance fully to grieve the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg before confronted with Amy Coney Barrett as her replacement, notwithstanding that it's not unconstitutional and there's no obligation to replace a liberal with a liberal on the court, of course. But even so, just the timing of it and the closeness to the election seemed so dark. There is an opportunity here, and I understand why Biden didn't want to talk about expanding the court in the final few weeks of the campaign, but perhaps starting this week and next week and the week after, we have to. Otherwise, nothing's really going to change.
I agree with that, and I'm hopeful, and I agree with the sentiment. And when I give these talks, I often ask by young people, why aren't you really pessimistic? And I'm actually not, because I think we're at the dawning of a new epoch, and we're going to do something really exciting, which the world has really never seen, which is we're going to have a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, and we're going to make it work. But the birthing pains are quite substantial, and a lot of white Americans are resistant to the idea of the country giving up its traditional identity as a white nation and as a Christian nation. But these changes are going to happen. Stephen Miller can have his way and cut off every immigrant coming to the country. But with differential birth rates, the country is going to be non-white. And given the current rate of secularization, the idea of a white Christian nation is disappearing very quickly, even if it hasn't already disappeared. So young people are more tolerant. Young people are more supportive of equality for gays, equality for lesbians. They're more supportive of genuine gender equality for women. They're more supportive of doing something about this severe, extreme, nonsensical economic inequality that we've allowed to develop in the last 40 years. So I'm actually quite optimistic. The real question is, can by suppressing democracy and taking advantage of these structural democratic deficits, can you eke out another electoral cycle win or two? And the consequences for climate change are just enormous. I mean, if we haven't already waited too long, we need to do something immediately. Joe Biden needs to do something. That needs to be one of this first package of reform measures. And that's certainly something the Supreme Court could strike down. I mean, there are probably 5 justices to overturn this famous decision from 2007, Massachusetts versus EPA, which is what gave the EPA in the first instance the ability to regulate climate change. Now, that was a statutory interpretation. So if you wanted to prevent the court from overturning it, you could just pass another statute. But the court has also cut back on Congress's power to regulate under the Commerce Clause. So I don't think there's any way you can allow the court the opportunity to strike this down. Did you want me to say something about what Barrett might change on the court? I mean, we've alluded to that, but we haven't actually talked about it. I can run through that pretty quickly if you want.
Yeah, people have heard about it, but I don't know. I mean, I think we have alluded to some of the things you'd be most concerned about, and some things you said perhaps you're less concerned about. You said you're less concerned about the Supreme Court striking down the Affordable Care Act.
I don't think.
What about versus Wade? She's really pretty much on record saying she would do that.
She always has the argument that that was me as a private citizen and law professor, but as a judge, I care about precedent. Let me say a couple things. So this is already the most conservative court since the 1930s, and now it just became more conservative. It's now a 6-3 majority without somebody who can accurately be described as a swing vote of the ilk of Justice Kennedy or Justice O'Connor or Justice Powell. So in terms of ideological balance, Chief Justice Roberts is no longer the swing vote, and he has voted in several cases, I think almost certainly strategically with the liberals, to uphold the Affordable Care Act in 2012. to strike down the census question on immigration in 2019, to reject the challenge to the DACA program last term. Here's what I think we know with some confidence. Whether she'll overturn Roe or not, the court will gut Roe. So they may just say, we're not going to overturn a precedent, but they will deprive it of most of its meaning states that are inclined to do so will have vastly greater discretion to regulate abortion. So these abortion clinic restrictions that Republicans in various states have been pushing in the last 10 or 15 years, and which the court struck down in 2016 when Kennedy was on the court, and which they refused to overturn because Roberts voted with the liberals last term. Those restrictions, at some point, the Supreme Court's going to say, go for it. We may not overturn Roe, but we're going to gut Roe of most of its meaning. I don't think she'll overturn the Affordable Care Act. She will vote to strike down race-based affirmative action. The court will overturn or gut the Fisher case from 2016. Race-based affirmative action will become essentially unconstitutional. There will be 5 votes or 6 to expand the Second Amendment to strike down most forms of gun control. My guess is that the assault weapons ban from 1994 would now be ruled unconstitutional, and that is one of the measures that the Biden administration would like to reenact. All campaign finance restriction will be struck down. They've already struck down most of it, but they will become even more aggressive. They might strike down disclosure requirements, for example. They might undo Buckley and strike down contribution limits. They will surely expand the rights to religious exemptions under the First Amendment, overturning a Scalia opinion, somewhat ironic because he's her mentor from 30 years ago that refused to carve out free exercise exemptions. And in some ways, most significantly, they will perform a radical change in administrative law. They will try to prevent administrative agencies from having discretion to interpret statutes. They will expand the power of presidents to control agencies. This is the part of the agenda that the billionaire conservative funders of the Republican Party care about. The Koch brothers don't care about a right to abortion. They don't care about a right to gay marriage. They're not religious. They're actually irreligious. What they care about is undermining government regulatory capacity. Specifically, they care about the EPA and the Interior Department because they're mostly fossil fuel extractors, and therefore they want to undo any kind of environmental regulation. So that's the investment. That's why the Koch brothers spend literally hundreds of millions of dollars supporting Republican candidates in every election cycle. That's why they spend literally tens of millions of dollars contributing to dark money campaigns to get Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh confirmed. And that is the agenda of the conservative judges who've grown up in the Federalist Society, undoing the modern administrative state. And then related to that, but not identical, is the Chamber of Commerce agenda, which is tort reform through limits on punitive damages, undermining class action litigation, which costs corporations billions of dollars, undermining the political power of labor unions, making sure that money in politics goes unregulated. Those are the kind of Chamber of Commerce issues that people are contributing money for. And these justices have grown up in that environment. It's not actually, a great conspiracy. They believe, like most Republicans, that class action litigation is a bad thing. Unregulated punitive damages are a bad thing. Labor unions are coercive and monopolist and corrupt. So they naturally gravitate towards that agenda. That's what I think will happen on the Supreme Court. Now, there's always the chance they'll behave strategically, and Roberts has always done that. And that might be why Brett Kavanaugh did not agree with the 3 in that case from North Carolina yesterday. Basically, 3 of the conservative justices said, if the North Carolina Electoral Commission wants to keep counting absentee ballots that are postmarked by Election Day but arrive late, 3 of the justices pretty much said that's unconstitutional. Kavanaugh and Roberts did not join that. And I'm actually a little surprised Kavanaugh didn't, given what he said in some of these other cases, like the Wisconsin one. I see that as a strategic vote to try to protect the court's institutional legitimacy. But again, to the extent they're being strategic, they understand they only need to do that as long as Democrats control the national government.
Michael, that recitation sounded like something out of a Joyce Carol Oates novel, I'm sad to say. And I liked it a lot better when we were talking about the new epoch of goodwill toward all. And
Democrats are going to win in a landslide more likely than not. It is an opportunity to do something, and we just need to make sure we don't squander it. And Obama did many great things in a very constrained environment, but he lost the power to do anything unless he did it by executive order after 2 years. Hopefully, and Obama went to great lengths to try to negotiate and accommodate Republicans. I just hope that Joe Biden doesn't believe this rhetoric that he likes to engage in about how Republicans are going to regain their senses once Trump isn't president. There is absolutely no reason to believe that. And I'm not even sure that Joe Biden believes it, and he needs to be dissuaded. So he also needs to be pushed to the left, because this is going to be a landslide victory, I think, knock on wood, for an agenda that is substantially to the left of what the Democratic Party would have agreed to 10 years ago.
well,
Right? Remember, Obama ran for president saying he does not support gay marriage. The Democratic Party in 2008 was not on board with dramatic immigration reform. The Democratic Party was not on board with universal health insurance, or at least a buy-in Medicare option. All those things are accepted by almost the entire Democratic Party, right? We might disagree about whether to do everything in the Green New Deal or whether to decriminalize the border. We don't disagree about whether 5 to 10 million people in the country who are undocumented ought to be on a path to citizenship. We don't disagree about everyone who wants to buy into Medicare ought to be able to do so. So here's an opportunity and a consensus, and just don't be dissuaded by Republican arguments that we should care about deficits or that Democrats aren't being bipartisan, right? Just laugh at them when they say that. I'm sorry to say that's true. Hopefully we can regain a bipartisan consensus, but you can't make deals with people who are crazy, and that's where the Republican Party is today. I'm sorry to say that. It sounds partisan. It's actually not. It's actually a factual statement.
now I'll revise what I said earlier, hopefully say it more accurately. Yeah, I mean, Biden in the early parts of the campaign was talking about, well, the good old days, I could work with folks across the aisle. I mean, the Republicans' word is no good anymore. I mean, you can't commit such grievous sins of hypocrisy as they have, and then say, what? We were just kidding, or we didn't mean it, or now you can trust me, though I was lying all those years before. I mean, I think you're right, and it's another argument for a landslide. For all the good he did, Obama and the Democratic Party in 2008, as you laid out earlier, was operating in an environment of still very close elections. I always thought when Obama, said what he said on gay marriage and gays in the military and all, it was with a wink and a nod. It was
absolutely.
Now because I have to, but don't worry, we'll get there. I'm getting us there. I mean, I always felt like, and he did. And it wasn't really evolving his politics. It was really more as he was able to do more politically, he did more politically, I think. But you're right, there's a window of time. Now, if you look ahead to 2022, Republicans are going to be defending Senate seats in a number of states where they may have issues, like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and a couple other places.
I looked at that the other day. I agree with you, actually. Democrats could, if it's not a disastrous political environment, win Senate seats in North Carolina, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. So that's why I try to say after another couple cycles, Democrats may never be able to win. And the evidence is simply, look, Donald Trump won lost the popular vote by 2 points, but he won the popular vote in 30 states. And we're now at a point where almost every Senate seat is going to go to the party that won the electoral votes. That's in 2016, that was the first time in American history in the 100 years that we voted for senators directly that happened. Everybody winning a Senate seat came from the same party as the person who won the electoral college vote. Now, if you do the math, Trump won 30 seats, even though he lost 2% of the vote. That means presumptively 60 Republican senators. It's actually the House I'm more worried about. In the same way as in 2010, the Democrats lost something like 60 House seats, a landslide. And it's not You know, it's mostly not because Obama did anything wrong. It's mostly because it's a completely different electorate who turns out in 2000 in the off-year elections. You know, it's something like 50% lower turnout. You know, in a presidential election, it could be 60%. And in an off-year election, it could be 40% of eligible voters. That's one of the reasons to entrench democracy. If you did that, one of the ways of entrenching democracy is to change all the off-year gubernatorial elections so that they're the same year as presidential elections. That would remove the Republican built-in advantage in 40 states, which is what enabled them to control the governorship in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania at the time the redistricting was done in 2010. That'd be another way in which you could entrench democracy. And I call it democracy entrenching. It's not democratic advantaging, because you get an electorate that is much more demographically representative of the country during presidential election years. So, you know, I just want to say in response to what you were saying earlier, Joe Biden has the chance to be FDR. And that's ironic because, you know, Barack Obama, who I think was a great president dealing with what he was dealing with, you know, a Republican Party that a majority of the members thought he wasn't born in the United States, which is just literal craziness. You know, Joe Biden has this opportunity, and you can only be a great president if you have the opportunity. And I think he understands this. He's talking about the first 100 days. He needs to do something on climate change. He needs to expand healthcare. All he needs to do is address the pandemic, right? The Republican Party's view is now, the North Dakota governor said the other day, dealing with the pandemic is not the job of government, right? I mean, that is the extreme radical libertarianism. I suppose the government's not supposed to do anything about hurricanes. The government's not supposed to fight forest fires. Maybe the government shouldn't deal with murder and crime, right? You can hire private security, right? Asking people to wear masks is asking people not to kill other people. Even extreme libertarians used to understand that wearing a mask, if all you're doing is killing yourself, well, maybe the government shouldn't regulate that. It's like a motorcycle helmet law. It's like a seatbelt law. Libertarians can make arguments that are not crazy arguments, but we don't wear masks to protect ourselves. We wear masks to protect other people. So you are basically saying, I have a right, it's a personal choice to kill someone else. That is crazy. And like I said, you can't negotiate with crazy. So Joe Biden has a chance to try to do something to rescue our country from this disaster where we've almost become a failed nation. I just gave a talk before I talked to you to these Harvard alumni from Germany, and they just think the United States has become pitiful. And that's what the rest of the world thinks. How can we have 4% of the world's population and 20% of the coronavirus deaths? How can the president literally be saying every day, we have turned a corner, when we are literally every day producing a new record in coronavirus cases? That is the and the Republican Party, do you hear any Republicans criticizing him by name? No, they don't criticize him. They're scared to death of him because 90% of Republicans think he's doing a good job. Now, I don't think those are bad people. I think most of them are just deeply uninformed. They're in the Fox News right-wing media ecosystem bubble. Trump somehow represents the leader of a team which is fighting to restore American greatness, which mostly means American whiteness and American Christianity. I don't think these are bad people, but that is 40 to 45% of the American public who thinks this guy is doing a great job. And that is dangerous. That is sad. The rest of the world obviously sees what's going on. They understand how awful this is. They don't resent the United States for it. They pity us for it. You know, we need to fix this.
There's no question, but you said something critical, which ties back to everything we've been talking about. It's 40 to 45% of the people who've been voting. It's not 40 to 45% of the country. And I've been thinking a lot about this, and I've said this in a couple of conversations I've had. Again, we were talking about false equivalency and that there's not always two sides to every issue. I don't think the country is polarized 50-50. You know, when we say we're in a polarized politics, it's almost assumed that that means, well, there's an equal number over here on this poll and there's to the number on this poll. I think we have a very loud, angry, uninformed, as you say, some part of which is Fox News kind of crazy, minority, actually. But if you did expand the electorate, if you expanded access to the vote in the ways that just seem so obvious, that that these things should happen, that 40 to 45% is going to be a lot smaller necessarily.
I agree with that. So if you look at the people who do not participate politically, they are 15% more democratic than the people who do participate. And even the people who do participate, as we're about to find out, seem to be right now about 8 to 10% more democratic. The congressional generic advantage for the Democrats is 7 points. Biden's up about an average of 9 points. However, having said that, Richard Nixon's popular approval was down in the 20s when he resigned, and Trump's popular approval is about 42, 43 points. Something has happened to the country. Barry Goldwater, when he ran for president, won something like 5 or 7 million fewer votes than Richard Nixon won 4 years before, because large numbers of Republicans said, this guy's crazy. I like the idea of passing Medicare. I don't think Social Security should be voluntary. And I certainly don't think we should be threatening to go to nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Yet now you have a president who attacks democracy, attacks the press as the enemy of the people, attacks courts, politicizes the entire government, lies pathologically. He's a racist. He's a misogynist. He's an Islamophobe. He delegitimizes the political opposition. Every day he's demanding that his Justice Department, the Attorney General, throw people in jail like his political adversaries. Every day he denies that he will necessarily support a peaceful transfer of power. Every day he refuses to openly and consistently criticize white supremacy. And yet 40 to 45% of people who are active politically are going to vote for him. That is a project that's going to require a lot of work to fix. And some of it is just very difficult because a lot of this is a function of people not living in the same factual universe. And it's very hard to solve that in a society that believes in a strong First Amendment. You can't shut down Fox News. And indeed, we're now getting something worse than Fox News, which is one American news network. And Trump, when he loses, is going to fund his own Trump media company. And that is a very challenging problem. And that's not the only problem. We've just divided into tribes, and all people, it's like Red Sox and Yankee fans, right? I don't care, if you're a Red Sox fan, I don't care if the Red Sox cheated that much. They won the World Series. I'm going to enjoy it whether they cheated or not. If you're a Yankees fan, if you're a Red Sox fan, you hate A-Rod. If you're a Yankees fan, you're going to defend A-Rod no matter how difficult a person he is. That's where we are now with the Republicans and Democrats. That's why 90% of the Republican Party voted for Donald Trump, even though a majority of the country did not support him in the primaries, right? They voted for him in the general election, and now they line up behind him. 75% of Republicans think he's doing a fine job with the coronavirus. I promise you, nobody in the rest of the world thinks he's doing a fine job with regard to the pandemic. We need to fix that, and that is not going to be an easy thing to fix.
Well, and there's no vaccine that's going to cure the problem of that 40 to 45% either. But, it is fascinating, just as a passing note. I've often thought, Trump likes to do these rallies. Everybody's got the MAGA hats, and it does almost resemble people who tailgate before a sporting event. It is like that there's nothing that Trump, the quarterback of this team, can do to lose the loyalty of these fans. They're not voters. It's almost like they're fans.
Yeah.
They've got their merch and they've got their cheers. Lock her up. I mean, they've got the
Ezra Klein talks about this in his terrific book on Why We're So Polarized, which just came out earlier this year. And that's actually where I got the analogy to sports teams. And it really has become that. And the ability to engage in biased perception and motivated reasoning is so powerful that it's not like, I gave a similar sort of talk to what I've been saying to you, to a Harvard alumni group last night or the night before, and there were Trump fans there, and they want to argue with me about whether he's a racist, and I give them 10 examples from his biography where he's done things that you can't disagree about this, but it doesn't have any effect on them, right? And I don't think they're bad people. It's that it's possible in today's world, given that we're so different in our worldviews, that additional facts don't actually persuade anyone. There's actually social science evidence that if I stand up and give the case I've made to you, if there are people who are very far on the ideological opposite end of the spectrum, they actually are just going to dig in their heels more, right? And then motivated reasoning allows you to believe things because you're just sorting through all the evidence and all the arguments. And this is a point that ties us back to legal interpretation. There's so many opposing modalities of interpretation and opposing canons of interpretation that you can always find the argument that will support your side. So, you know, the argument that the Affordable Care Act was unconstitutional struck almost everybody as ridiculous, and it wasn't even made by most Republicans in opposing the law in Congress. As you remember, the argument for the individual mandate was made by the Heritage Foundation 25 years earlier. But then once the law is passed and Republicans hate it because it's something that Obama passed and because it requires you to do something, and they're all radical libertarians, they came up with two arguments against it. And the arguments were not crazy in the sense that there was kind of precedent. So one of the arguments was Congress has never forced people to buy something before. And that was literally true, even though Congress was also regulating what is 1/6 of the national economy, which you would think is pretty clearly something you can regulate under the Commerce Clause. But it was true that literally there was no case saying Congress can regulate, can force you to buy something because Congress had never done it. The other argument was what's called the broccoli reductio, which is if Congress can make you buy healthcare, they can make you buy broccoli so you'll be more healthy. Now, the problem with that argument is in any other context, Republicans will not buy that argument. So, you know, I'm not even going to go through the analogy, but the reductio argument that you buy in one context but don't buy in another context is an illustration of how you can always find something in the legal materials. So to me, and Bush versus Gore is exactly the same thing, an absolutely contrived, ridiculous legal argument that no constitutional law expert would have credited this behind a Rawlsian veil of ignorance. But we don't decide cases in a Rawlsian veil of ignorance. We decide them with the presidency at stake. So of course, Republicans all believe that Democrats in Florida were trying to steal the election. So they had to come up with some, no matter how absurd, constitutional argument. So, you know, that's where we are right now. This has been a lot of fun for me, but I actually have a call where I need to persuade one of my former students who's working in Congress that we should pursue court reform. So I need to go. I've enjoyed it, and thanks a lot for having me.
It's a warm up then for that conversation. I want to thank you so much, Michael Klarman from Harvard Law. What a great conversation, and I've enjoyed it immensely. Thank you so much.
Me too. It was great to meet you, Aaron, and maybe we can do it again sometime. I'd enjoy that.
Thank you so much.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.